So good evening, everybody. I hate to interrupt the chat, but we'll have plenty of time to do that later on. And it's a real pleasure, as LSTM's Vice-Chancellor, to welcome you all here today for this very special and unique evening. I know that some of you have come from a long distance, but there are many others online. So wherever you are and wherever you come from, thank you very much for being here, and I hope you enjoy the evening. And before I hand over to our Chancellor, Elhadj, I'd like to start with a few words about the important role that he plays here at LSTM. The Chancellor is a key role in a university, acting as a ceremonial head. And for us, it's a new role, as is our first Chancellor. Previously we've had presidents, and he's following in the footsteps of those many individuals. But for us, it's really a key milestone, as was appointed only last year in our 125th anniversary year. We were looking for somebody that shared LSTM's value, that shared LSTM's mission, and someone who'd made a lifelong commitment to driving positive change and making an impact for those most in need. And from a diverse shortlist of potential candidates, we included people with a very strong global health activity, a strong global outlook. We were delighted to confirm as our new Chancellor. He's undoubtedly recognised around the world as a humanitarian leader, and he's dedicated his career to driving change in the humanitarian sector. He's currently chair of the Kofi Annan Foundation Board and a number of multiple advisory groups, and I don't quite understand how he keeps sane, given how much he travels around the world, but those boards include Welcome. He's also had a vast experience in global health leadership, in the humanitarian sector, in many other sectors, working on pretty much every continent. It's kind of difficult when you talk to us to find a country he's not visited and doesn't know intimately. And he's worked at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, UNICEF, United Nations Programme on HIV/AIDS, the Global Fund. Pretty much you name it, he's been there. And that's demonstrated in the contacts and the wide network, and I think also in a number of great friends that have come here today to hear him speak, and we really appreciate that. And it's kind of that lifelong commitment, his passion, his inspirational approach that made Az the perfect choice for LSTM's first Chancellor. There's no doubt, I think, that over the last years, he's more than justified that choice. He's been a passionate ambassador for LSTM. He's been given us very generously of his time. He's led by example. He's inspired the community around him. And he's impressed everyone with his wisdom and his compassion. And so I'm really delighted to welcome you to share your experiences as our first LSTM Chancellor. Thank you.
Colleagues, friends, these are humanitarian settings. And I think the silence that we just experienced at the beginning, that is how it feels. When you happen, to stand, in the middle of ruins, once were nice buildings. That is how it feels when you stand there, thinking of those who lived there before. Some of them rescued, surviving, many buried forever, under these rubbles. These situations are not normal. These are not normal situations because overnight, once, proud fathers and mothers, lose everything, including their own identity. They have no names anymore. They are called the refugees, the displaced people, the IDPs, the victims. These are no identities of anybody. These are just situations. Situations where each of us could find ourselves in if we had the misfortune to have been in these places, at that time. This is not normal situation because, again, once proud father who used to care for his family, has to line up 40 degrees, under the sun to go back home with a bag of rice or a bag of maize. And it is not normal, to look at this proud father, and then you can read gratitude in his eyes, but at the same time, you can read shame. Shame because of, his dignity that is being, eroded. That is not normal, because when you stand here, like I did with Chris, I think it was in Palau in Indonesia, where there was a phenomenon called liquefaction, when suddenly the earth, started melting. And then if you were not able, to save anybody in the first hours, we just stand there and mourn and pray. This is not normal. This is not normal. That you express and then witness experience. This child who is so stunned that he can't even cry anymore. And this look will just, prick, into your heart, and then will leave, bruises on our whole humanity. So we always have to remember and then remind ourselves that when we work, in humanitarian settings, we are not working in normal situations. So what are these people crying for? Of course, they cry for shelter and appreciate when they get it. They cry for water, sanitation, hygiene. What do they cry for, really? Is, to look at 122 million people today who have to leave home because home is no longer safe. If these people were a population of one country, it will be one of the biggest countries on earth today. This is what we call the displaced, the forcefully, displaced people. People, they cry for normalcy. They cry for peace. They cry to recover a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. A complete state of physical, social, and mental well-being. That is how WHO defines health in its constitution. So then it is fair to say that what people cry for above all is that they cry for health. They cry for health to be normal. Again, they cry for health to recover what is most important to them and to us, which is our own dignity. So indeed, that's what we do if we work in humanitarian settings. We care, we support. We also try to accompany people to heal the trauma, the physical ones that we always see. Also try to heal the invisible wounds that people live with. To try to heal the relationship with oneself after having experienced this. And maybe also to try to heal the relationship with each other so that we can be human again. This is the reason why we say there is no humanitarian response without health. Those of us who have been in those many settings, we cannot remember any single one. When health, is not a major component of. So much so that we often in advance, prepare ourselves, with what we call, our toolbox. Because with experience sometimes that think we know it all. Of course we prepare for water, sanitation and hygiene. We prepare for trauma. Of course, we prepare for psychosocial support, a number of times. But every time we discover something that we've never been prepared for. We've never been, prepared to just, meet the child that just should be a silly, chill child. But then witness something that a child should have never seen and experienced before. You're never prepared that, suddenly you become a, frontline, healthcare worker, and having to deliver babies, in the most difficult, circumstances, to see again the resilience, of human beings, life lost, life gained, and again and again. And that is the reason why every humanitarian crisis becomes a children's crisis. Either you are there or you watch it on TV, you see children everywhere who are being impacted. It is what health workers, do in those difficult circumstances. Because they know, and we know, that every mother, no matter where she is, just wants the best for her child. Either in the most affluent and rich societies or in a refugee camp. Because we know also that every baby and every newcomer to our human society, deserve the same care, the same love, the same support. So that we see then, while the situation that I was describing before, they do reveal quite often the worst in us human beings. We are the ones, who fight each other. We are the ones who destroy what we have built. We're the ones, who, take us back, to and destroy many of the progresses we have made, in many of the areas that we work on a daily basis. But these situations are also, particularly if you have healthy interventions, they do reveal the best in us. They show us how much we can care, how much we can support, how much we can hold on each other's hands. And in those situations, you see generosity in poverty. In those situations, you see communities were there before us, and that is important to remind ourselves. It doesn't matter how quick, how fast we intervene in any humanitarian settings. We always find there people who were there before us. You may remember this reggae song, of Burning Spear, talking about Christopher Colombo, who said, well, he's the first one who discovered America. Well, what about my grandfather who was there before him? But it is seriously than what we experience. It is often the poorest of the poor who share the last grain they have, with the newcomers in their communities. It is often the poor woman with only one cloth on her body that rip it off, to wrap, the newborn baby, before we arrive. It is also this poor lactating mother, who forgets sometimes, her own children, and then jumped on to, breastfeed, this orphan baby, or this baby with a mother who's so sick, not to take care, of him or her. That is very important to remember, that when we say that we need to have community engagement, then we ask ourselves, who's engaging whom? And then we always remember that there are communities there reacting, responding, coping, caring, supporting. And if we do not understand that and then build on it, our response, will fall short. And I'll come back to that. It is also amazing, that, again, in those very difficult circumstances, the resilience, that people can show, which is something that you just, never forget. Well, under normal circumstances, we easily complain about, our health issues. You're in these settings, you ask somebody, as we do when we greet each other, how are you? Well, after my leg, was broken and I had, some malaria, afterwards, and then unfortunately, I got some chest infection. But apart from that, I'm fine. I'm okay. You just, show us again, what resilience means. Show us again what hope, means. And striving, all of us to find, solutions to the problems, we face together. But when we do so, we always have also to remember and remind ourselves that we are human. We should always remind ourselves that we are not the only creatures on this earth. If we work in humanitarian settings, we encounter also other creatures that are also coping, that are also striving, that are also trying also to run to safety. And unless also we care, about them in the one planet we share, we will never be able also to meaningfully care for each other. Of course, we care for this creature, but when we do so, we care for her companion, who would never, at times, leave her behind in the mud, and sometimes at the risk of her or his own life. Human health, animal health, planetary health is maybe the one health, that we should, strive for. And it finds, its real meaning in the humanitarian settings, where we were. In those settings, the other creatures also run for safety like we humans do. And sometimes, when we find ourselves in the same place of refuge, the encounter may not be so nice. They also run for safety during floods. We also do. And this can be, the consequences, of these encounters. So when LSTM, is working on snakebite envenoming, it is something that is, in normal settings, but it is more important in the settings, that are not normal. If we talk about also reaching those that are hardest to reach and that are most vulnerable, where do we find them? So in those very places. And I think, beyond what we do every day in teaching, in research, but also in trying, to implement, those research, to action to save lives and alleviate human suffering. This is one example I'm very proud of, when I talk about what LSTM is doing. Congratulations, David, for that. But health is not only a response to emergencies and to humanitarian settings. Health is also becoming an emergency of its own and a humanitarian setting of its own. The setting that I showed before, unfortunately, are more frequent than ever before. They are more severe than ever before. Conflicts are protracted. Some of them we are living in today, we don't even remember when they started. Remember when the war in Afghanistan started? We're still there. Who remembers when the war in Somalia started? We're still there. Maybe we remember, but not exactly, the number of years within which we've been in the wars in Syria. Hopefully, it will be peace soon. The protracted nature, of those crises, plus the severity of the shocks and hazards that are climate-related, that we are confronted with on a daily basis, lead us to understand that shocks and hazards are natural, disasters are human. Our level of preparedness, our ability to respond early, and when we respond, what are we leaving behind so that next time around, when we experience the same shock and hazards, communities and ourselves, will be in a different capacity to withstand it. But year in, year out, conflict in, conflict out, shocks and hazards in, shocks and hazards out, we seem to be coming, quite often, like we are starting from the beginning. But the communities that we are serving, they were there before the shock. They were there during, and they're thereafter. And we should not be surprised then at time, when we come, and then we hear questions like, where were you before? And why are you coming now with your Ebola? Why are you coming now with your Marburg? Why are you coming now with your Lassa? Maybe because those are threats, to you and then others, and only then we do care about us. And that is the reason why it is always important, to understand those community dynamics, when we intervene, in these settings. Ebola response was now an example, that shows us, how health, is an emergency of its own, but at the same time, does reveal the dysfunctionalities, that we see in our systems and that we need to understand better. We know, for example, that people diseased of Ebola were up to 10 times more infectious, than people who are living with it, Amadou. And what was then very important, to help people when they care for the deceased loved ones, they do not infect each other and continue to fuel the epidemic. In the technical jargon, it used to be called dead body management. Communities don't manage dead bodies. They respectfully, in a dignified manner, accompany their loved one to their last place of rest. Communities do not cover, their deceased people in black body bags. How many of us, did have in our stocks? Thousands of body bags, in case, we're facing these emergencies. We never asked about the color. We never asked about how it should look like. We didn't even ask, how it should be called. And of course, when we get into Sierra Leone and Liberia and Guinea, that was back in 2014, I think. Some of us were stoned. Our cars, were stoned. Some of our health workers were even killed. And we called it community resistance. Communities are resisting, the response. Communities are resisting, the vaccines. But we didn't simply do our homework, so that we have communities buy-in. And we buy into communities' dynamics, so that we can accompany them, to the real response that will be long-lasting. When we moved, from dead body management to safe and dignified burials, to black body bags, to white body bags, then the dynamics, become, completely different. So we always, need to remember that. But I think what we need, to remember also is that, our caring and support does not stop with the end of life. The way that then we treat people who are deceased is also an expression, of health. It is an expression of also our common humanity. Hence again, the importance of the word dignified, in what we are doing and everything, we are doing, in health. And that is the reason why, if you look at the Geneva Convention on the amelioration of the condition of the wounded and sick armed forces, this was back in 1864. I think that was from Solferino, in the battle, of Solferino, where people started, to say that, even wars, should have rules in the way we treat, people, the way we treat wounded soldiers, in the way we treat, civilians. And the conventions, went on later, to be improved, taking into account the realities, of the situations that are coming from the field. And the changes, in behaviors and attitudes, even in the way, wars, are conducted. Nowadays, there are not many soldiers who die on the battlefield, because the battlefield is everywhere. The battlefield, unfortunately, is no longer those places where two armies, meet and fight, and then the winner go back, to the society. It is on our streets, it is, in our restaurants, it is in our schools, unfortunately. It is even, in our hospitals, and our health infrastructure. As I said, and then one of the rules which I always remind myself, which is the rule 113 of the Convention, which is about the treatment of the dead. The obligation to take all possible measures to prevent the dead from being despoiled or pillaged. So reminding us, if we're not able to care for our dead, we will not be able to care for our living fellow human beings. And that is all that continuation. And then that cycling back, that make us human. And that is really what health, is about in such a setting. But unfortunately today, health is not only a response, health also is a damage. These were the emblems that were protected, before. You don't shoot at ambulances. We do. In our professional life, Michelle, visiting you in the DRC, then you remember, even in the course of our own professional life, there were days, where you go to the most difficult places, to the most dangerous one. You put up the Red Cross flag and then the UN flag, and then you had a red carpet. to go. In the course of our own professional life, we found ourselves in the same situations where we had to hide the flags. And that says a lot about what it means to deliver health in humanitarian settings, what it means really to be aware of when we have to work in humanitarian settings. It is so important, to mention those health infrastructure, where we have to build in the most difficult places. And sometimes when we describe the situation with the doom and gloom, which is a reflection of a reality that we all have to experience and to be aware of. If we are not aware of them, we will not be able to manage them. They force us, to be humble. They force us, to question ourselves and question our own certainties when we get into the field. To question ourselves in order to be open to new learning, to new understanding, and then to new dynamics so that we can espouse them and then get the kind of results that we would like to see. It is forcing us also, to see, next to the worst that I mentioned, the best also that you experience, and then the rewards that you get, in being in such settings. And I used to say that in those settings, you see generosity in the middle of poverty. You see dignity in the face of multiple forms of humiliation. You see resilience in the form of multiple deprivations. You will see also beauty. You even see beauty in misery. Because what every people, would like to do in those settings is just, to be human again, and then children to be children again. When we were in Syria and in Homs, in the middle of the ruins, and we meet children, they did not ask us for candies, they did not ask us, for health, they did not ask us for medication. They invite us, to ride a bike, with them, between the ruins. Because they just want to be children again. They call on you and then tell you their own stories. Their stories, that will be inspiring you and then stay with you, forever. At times when you think, after having worked, like we present and introduce ourselves, 35 years, in the humanitarian settings, and then you think you know it all. And then you have the toolbox, that will be solving all the problems, and then you will be adding, psychosocial support. And maybe now you need to bring in, some anthropologists, to better understand, the community dynamics. And then you find yourself, in the middle of a hurricane, in Barbuda and Antigua, where everything is lost, and then you open your toolbox. You have your water purification tablets. You have your malaria tablets. You have, what it needs, to do first aid, for your trauma. And then you realize that maybe you cannot access everything, that you wanted to buy, so you give cash, for people to buy them themselves, and then get the medication for the next course. And then this beautiful lady, with the wonderful Caribbean accent that I cannot imitate, and say, "Oh, thank you so much, sir. With this, I can even buy a pair of earrings, for my daughter's birthday." Well, I didn't think that, we had, put, a pair of earrings, in our toolbox, when we had to go, in the humanitarian settings, and help people. But at that very moment, what the most important thing, to recover dignity, for that lady, and then get to the mental health status that she wanted it to be, was exactly to get that. So we learn, and that is simply human. You learn to be thanked, with a small flower from a small child. And I had hoped, this flower was in plastic so that you can keep it, forever. But it will continue to grow in your own heart. And this is, just, to be human. You learn to be asked, to help, to cycle. Well, if you have feet, like mine, so it's difficult, but you try. And if I talk about, beauty in the middle of all of that, this is what it means. That you rescue, the person, a small person, a small human beings, out of rubbles, and then brought back, this smile on the face, that will be just telling you it is all worth it. It is worth it because it is not always easy, and that's important that each of us engaging in that, we remind ourselves. We care, we die while caring. We died 55 times in Syria during my time at the helm of IFRC. 55 times writing letters of condolences for people who come just a week before, look at you and say, I'm so inspired by what you're doing. I want to go to the field and then make a contribution and never come back again. That is also a reality, that we have to face. We did it, 12 times, in Yemen. That was in a period of one every month in a year, 12 times. And the list, can go on and on and on. That is the reason why when I often talk about we carers, we need to care about ourselves. And we need to care to build that community of carers, to support each other, continue to cope. Because you will never get used to that. It doesn't matter how many times you do it. It doesn't matter how long you do it. The day you think you're used to it and then you don't feel the pain anymore, that is maybe the day that you should stop, doing it. But how to find the right balance, to feel it, but at the same time, have the force, to continue. And nobody, and none of us alone, can do it. Well, if you see my friends here sitting and then coming all the way, thousands of miles away to come and be here, it's not to listen to what I'm saying because they lived it many times like I did. Some of us, we lived it together in the field. This is the community of carers that I'm talking about. We cried on each other's shoulders, Michelle, a number of times, just because that's what we've seen and how we needed to support each other, to move on. Amadou, we did it on the lab, in the lab, and in the field together. Many of these pictures were taken by Chris himself because we were there experiencing, the same thing. And then go back, either under our tent and then back to where we belong to. Have to see how we can support each other to move on and then to carry on. We also build that communities that almost, become our own family. So Dawda walked in my office many years ago as a very young student, saying, okay, I just want to volunteer and then make my contribution. Volunteered and later on become the director of the very office, that he worked on. And then today, one of the greatest leaders, worldwide. Tumani, you keep on the flame, burning to hand it to the next generation for excellence in research, in Africa. And I can see no presentation needed in Nduku, honoris causa, doctorate, LSTM, showing many other friends. Ray, here, part of, many of the battles, that we've been to. Why I'm saying that? This is the communities, that really hold us together, that we get inspiration from. And sometimes when we are in doubt, and it is okay to be in doubt, to doubt sometimes, to question our certainties, to doubt, to show our weakness, in a safe environment, and then to get the support that is required, so that together, we build that communities of carers. Thanking each other, supporting each other, and really congratulating each other under the very difficult circumstances. That is what keeps us going. Now, in times like this, friends and colleagues, it's time to go back to basics. Back to the international humanitarian law that has to be respected, so that we don't accept that humanitarian space should keep on being shrinking, and meaning that, a courage, to work in a humanitarian setting will be measured by the number of people that will be dying on the line of duty. That is totally unacceptable. We have to go back, to basic, and understand that there is no peace without health, that there is no health without peace. And the very communities that we're working with, what they're crying for, what they're striving, that is the same thing that we all are crying for, which is, for human dignity. Dignity which is in the face of the multiple humiliation. If you compare it, to a blanket, that will be the last blanket, that should be ripped off. We need to be covering ourselves in order to have the self-esteem to seek for health, but also the respect for others in order to care and then support them. And then to go back to where we all belong to and share the values, which is the one and only humanity we all share. And then if at LSTM we say we serve those that are greatest in need, those that are most vulnerable, those that are need us most, here is the place, to do it. And I hope that we will all support each other, hold each other's hand, so that we continue to save lives and alleviate human suffering. And I thank you.
Thank you very much for that honest, that humbling, that thought-inspiring talk. I think it will stay with many of us for a long time. We talked yesterday about the importance to our graduating students, about the importance in standing on the shoulders of giants. And I think there's no doubt we've just heard a talk from one of those giants. So thank you very much. If you'd like... Have a seat. And we've now got time for questions. Az is happy to talk about questions on any topic, I'm told. So feel free. He has a broad experience that we can share. Yeah. There's a microphone coming.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Isra Saleh. I consider myself a genocide survivor. I came from Gaza. I'm a medical doctor, and now I'm a PhD student at LSTM. So I'm a lucky person. I've listened to every word that you said, and I have lived every moment. I have experienced everything that you describe, and there are other things, that's undescribable. What I wanted to say that regarding the international laws, and despite there are many international laws, and despite the healthcare workers are respected and their work is appreciated in the field, especially in the humanitarian crisis or during a catastrophic situation like Gaza, despite all of this, none of international laws were able to protect healthcare providers in Gaza Strip. I'm saying that, and I'm so sorry, but I'm being too emotional because we lived and we lost also our beloved ones working in the field. And also, one important thing that, unfortunately, Gaza Strip context as a humanitarian context is completely different than I say it, because I saw that and I witnessed that from any different humanitarian context, not only in the aspect of the healthcare system, but also in different aspects related to the destruction of the whole infrastructure, the education collapse, malnutrition, the famine, etc. So it was completely different, and sometimes what applied in other contexts, in other similar humanitarian contexts like Syria, for example, which is similar also in the cultural background and in certain aspects, it's completely different applying that in Gaza and vice versa. So I just wanted to add these two important points because despite we as a well-educated persons were working in the field and we were considering ourselves having impactful work there, but we were also experiencing what other people were experiencing, and we were, as you mentioned, IDPs. So we lost part of identity, unfortunately, in our home country. Thank you very much, and I hope the support, the interventions is continued there, despite the genocide is being said it's stopped, but unfortunately it's still ongoing, the suffering there. So I hope the support is still ongoing as before and even more. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for that contribution. I happen to have been in Gaza a number of times. I've been there in times where it was more relatively calm, and I say relatively because Gaza Strip in itself is not normal. And then you have the big shock, that happened, after that is starting drawing attention to that. And I've been there in different times, different, circumstances. What we humanitarians are doing, we are not the ones solving the root cause of the problems. We are alleviating, the suffering, but at the same time, calling on those, who then have, the responsibility, to solve the problems, to solve it. My personal view is that there is a breakdown in leadership in the world to find solutions to the problems. That's why I was talking about the protracted nature, of the crisis. Why do wars start and then we cannot stop them? And that is becoming, unfortunately, the rules. And that is the reason why we're now talking about humanitarian settings rather than emergency settings. Because, the nature of emergency is it is short. You go in, you solve it, you take it to a certain level of normalcy, and then you go to the next level of resilience, and then people move on. But you start there, you are there, almost, or forever. So I feel with you what you were talking about in Gaza, and I could say more about it at the political level, at the social level, at the dysfunctionalities of the world, at the breakdown of leadership, etc., etc. I think, and all of that, is real. But none of that, will prevent us, for the sake of humanity, to continue, to do what we're doing and never give up. And that is the reason why, you have the 5 fundamental principles when you work in humanitarian settings. They ask you, to be impartial. That does not mean you don't care. They ask you to be neutral. It doesn't mean that you don't feel it. But these are, principles, that protect you. But they ask you also to be independent, and one forgets that. We talk about always, neutrality, impartiality. Well, be independent, with regard to all of that, so that you can chart your own course in the response. But the mother of all those principles is the humanity, the principle, that we really have to, focus on and abide to. No humanitarian settings is the same like the other, none of them. And you cannot even compare what is worse, or better. No, none of them is, the same. If you see what is happening in Sudan today, where people are trying to run for safety, where are they going to? To Chad, to northern Chad, where there's nothing. The only hospital, that they were, having left, they then become bombed. 400 people killed in a hospital. Where people from South Sudan are running for refuge, 1 million of them were to Uganda. Lebanon is hosting 1 million people. Jordan is hosting, 1 million people. And then when you live in a very rich country and then you have, 100 people coming, so it's an invasion, of refugees. I think those are all the dysfunctionalities that we're saying. It is important, to be aware of, and that's the reason why I'm insisting on that. We are in a, learning and training institutions where also our students, are motivated coming and then doing, humanitarian studies. They need to understand, those settings, not to be discouraged, not to be, overwhelmed, that you humanly feel it, fine. And as I say, you have to. But then, to be mindful of all of that in order to be able to navigate it. And when it is then becoming overwhelming and too difficult, you go to your communities, and then get, the kind of support that is needed to, to carry on.
Thank you. Any other questions? Anything online, Claire? No. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. My question is, I'm originally from Sudan. So, as you know, the conflict is just ongoing in Sudan. And before Sudan separate, even after separation also, 2001, I was working with Save the Children UK in Darfur. And this conflict started. I work in development sitting and emergency sitting in Darfur. And nowadays, every day, the things is going worse. My question is, we as a humanitarian community, and we have power of humanitarian aid, how can we use this power and convince or to force these two parties to sit for peace? My second question is, our people now, they are the three generations, IDPs or refugee. And I think this long time affects their resilience. How we are as humanitarian workers or humanitarian community, how we can help them to strengthen the local people or people in the IDPs camp to stand for themselves and mobilize themselves again and stand for those people who kill them every time with different themes. They started with political things, and now they tend to be community or society, and every time those people who kill, those people, they took different themes to kill more people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The tragedy of Sudan, which also unfortunately also happened now because being there in many times, in different times, and I witnessed also firsthand many of those events, that you were highlighting. We were there, during the separation. In fact, I was sitting on the whatever called the official platform, and we're celebrating the independence of South Sudan. And then the tragedy of both countries, South Sudan and then Sudan, always, are on the shoulders of two people. And that is totally unacceptable. two people fighting for power and then burning a whole country and creating this horrible situation, that we were saying, which is just, totally unacceptable. Then the world is watching, and I keep on reminding often a time when I'm talking to leaders and political leaders on the African continent in particular, to say, stop the nonsense, care for yourself and for your people, because otherwise nobody will do it, nobody cares. If you believe, frankly, that the world will stop and then concentrate on Sudan or Central African Republic, or somewhere else in the Sahel, so we're just leading ourselves. So I think that leadership that should be emerging, for peace and reconciliation can only come from within. And often at the time, it is just two people fighting for power, which is totally, disgraceful, outrageous, and totally unacceptable. That was the same in South Sudan. That is the same, in Sudan today. And why are the people suffering from it? The most vulnerable, those who don't even have the right to exercise, the citizenship on a basic, level. If you go now to those camps that you know very well because you worked in Darfur, then you ask how many people do even have birth certificate? How many children have birth certificate to show that they are Sudanese? How many adult people have IDs, to show, their citizenship? Which is just the basic, for the exercising your rights and getting your voice heard and getting, visible, as citizens, for that. So the role, I think, for humanitarian, workers is that there are many dimensions. Today, I was focusing on health, which is very important. That is what people will cry for. But the other one is protection. Protection, of civilians. And those aspects that I talked about are integral part of protection. Birth certificate, ID, vital registration, having your right of citizenship, having your voice, heard, creating your own dynamic environment, to organize yourself your own way, because we cannot get involved, in the kind of a political dynamics, to it. And then challenge, leadership, wherever we find it, in every corner, in every settings, be it in regional institutions, be it in the UN, be it in many different parts where we intervene, to ask, for solutions for it and keep on, carrying, forward in that regard. So I think it is high time, that local leadership for peace, regional leadership, for peace, be empowered and then supported, to find lasting solutions, for those problems. Until then, unfortunately, we don't have any other possibility and opportunity that to carve out a humanitarian space and, again, alleviate human suffering, save lives, where we can, give hope, when despair, is the mode, and then, help to build on the resilience of people to carry on. So I'm sure you could have your own views on the questions you have asked, because you know the place very well, being from it yourself. And I think that it may be that common knowledge that we should gather, all of us, and then play our bits from wherever we are, for lasting solutions.
Thank you. Time for one final question. Yeah, there's one here at the front. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for such an inspiring lecture. I think it really captivated the audience. And I agree with you pretty much every point you made, including the importance of this topic when the link between this and poverty is now so strong. I think even looking at your career, things have changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and now 4 or 5 out of 10, 4/10 of the world's poor people are living in these situations almost semi-permanently, fragile and conflict and violence-affected states. It's not just an outlier. It's now 4/10 of the world population who are poor are living in these locations, which makes it doubly important. But just when you take the big picture, the quick question I had for you: over your career, you've seen these changes, not all of them good, but there must be some good things as well. And my question was, in your discipline, are there new techniques of resilience in health systems or new approaches you're taking which maybe can never get us quite ready for the extreme pressures that you see, but at least can put us in a better position than we would be if we were just kind of going in the normal path? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, you're right. If I had a map, a world map today, and I describe, the places where there are conflicts, and I take another map, where we have, the shocks and hazards that are related, to climate, and I take a third map, where we have, most recently, the pandemics and epidemic outbreaks. It's highly likely, that we find ourselves not in the same places, so they are interlinked, for sure. And but as I said, despite all of that, you will have, all those number of people still living in those settings, waking up every day, developing their own strategies for survival, their own coping mechanisms, and their networks of solidarity. And that is most of the time happening at the community level. So I always, put a great emphasis, on that. And sometimes, the resolutions, of the problems, start also there in order to go back all the way up. I can give you a number of examples. One that I experienced, which was very moving for me, was Somalia. Where almost everybody gave up. It's a tribal society. There is nothing you can do about it, and so on and so forth. And then you have extremist groups, that are very dangerous. They call them Islamists or whatever. And one of them was called Al-Shabaab. And then they decided one day, every organization leave. UN, NGO, MSF, Red Cross, everybody, you leave. Well, if Al-Shabaab asks you to leave within 24 hours, well, you think you better leave. So some of us, we decided, so let's talk to them and understand why they make this decision. And it was very complicated for security, of course, and then through different channels and negotiating rite of passage, talking to this tribal chief and then this religious leader and so on. So we arrived and met whoever was called himself, Sultan something. And he said, okay, you're from UNICEF? Say yes. I was working that with UNICEF. You're Elhadj? Say yes. Okay, you can stay. So when I was going there, so I had my notebook and I prepared myself very well, what will be what I'm going to say to convince him, children, and then children in African societies, even children in Islam and so. But I didn't say anything, so you can stay. Before I turned my back, I said, oh, you can stay because you never left us. Because, my predecessors, you and the people who come after you in UNICEF and work there for 30 years and never left, gave me then the benefit, of being accepted, not to leave. When I say communities don't forget and they remember, that is a very important thing. That is one element only. The other element is then to talk to them, well, there will be only local solutions to local problems, guys. What can be done. They started, to come together and then organize, meetings, between pastoralists and farmers. Because that was a source of conflict, in times where people were the herders, were going for, grazing land. And then the farmers, they get into conflict, and then started, escalating, at the whole level. And then people from outside, not understanding the dynamics, that is just a tribal thing, they can understand each other. And so when they started, to come together, and then understanding when is the time when you can allow, herds to go through, when is the seasons, where, you are preparing for harvest, and then you have to respect, those rules. How do you manage, the access, to water in a terribly arid land? Then you start building a culture of peace. And that, started escalating at a level where you start getting a certain level of normalcy. It is only then, when I think the more formal parts, start understanding it. And I've been working, and I'm still with an organization called Interpeace, who is together with the Kofi Annan Foundation, to see how you can build, on those community dynamics in order to get, a lasting peace, in that regard. And we were wondering if that could be even, a source of inspiration for what is going on in South Sudan in particular, because, some of the dynamics, are very similar. So we have seen also in the course, of that time, sometimes, good news, do not come, as news, but some of us who worked 20 years ago in Central African Republic, well, so they're going now to the next, presidential elections, I think in a couple of weeks, and, running their campaign, I think, in a country that you could not even, think that something, like that, is possible. You had a similar situation 30 years ago in Ghana, where we're going, from one coup, to another, being given a portrait today as a model, of democracy, in West Africa. So we had almost a civil war, so in Côte d'Ivoire. Michel has flown from Côte d'Ivoire this morning because he was there for the inauguration, of the president, we have many, such examples, that I think, will give us hope, that it is possible. So I was more talking about, what are the problems, to solve, and the challenges, to be mindful of in order to get, to the kind of, positive, situations. But having said that, globally, there is a need, a big need, really for leadership to find solution to problems. And there, I think there's a breakdown, in leadership. So there are not many of the global leaders today we look up to say, he will be then solving the problem. Being at the head of a state or the head of a, organization, and there is a breakdown. Well, we also need to understand there will be a generational transition, for sure. Gen Z asking for something completely different. I'm not sure we're always listening or understanding, but there will be disruptions, coming along the way. So now I'm in another domain that I'm talking about. And I think political leaders who don't understand that, they do not take that into account, will pay a huge price for it. And then we all, our society, are better be prepared, to understand, those dynamics and start embracing it, because you can only live in your time.
Thank you. And I think that's a really good point to finish. Just like to thank Az once more for a fantastic talk. He'll be around now for the next 35, 40 minutes next door, and there's drinks just out this floor? Yeah, just outside. So thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Az.